Perfect. Um, so welcome to Erasing Indigenous Myths by Gitz Crazyboy, the land acknowledgement. A recognition that we are on stolen land is not enough when the genocide we call history still continues today and is reinforced by the daily lives of those who are unaware. Residential schools only closed their last doors in 1996, but the mentality lives on. White people, imagine living in a place that not only normalizes genocide, but actively covers it up. We don't live here because a peaceful treaty was signed. We live here because white people before us brutally pushed their way in. This includes our current government, RCMP, and church. And we need to acknowledge this and the harmful systems it brought with it before we can even attempt reconciliation. It is a privilege to not know that you are living in such a way that makes genocidal reality seem like regular everyday life. I would still like to recognize that the stolen land I am speaking from is rightfully the home of the Blackfoot nations and was forced to be the home of Treaty 7. This land is the traditional territories of the Blackfoot nations where the Siksikaitsitapi lived and practiced their oral traditions as far back as existence goes. These nations are Siksika, Dene, and Piikani. Treaty 7 was signed on September 22nd in 1877 in a brutally unethical way. This treaty was not upheld. This treaty includes the Tsuut'ina Nation, the Stoney Nakoda Nations, and the Métis Nation of Region 3. So this space, as Calgary, is actually rightfully known as Mohkinstsis. The speaker today, Gitz Crazyboy, is a Siksikaitsitapi and Dene youth facilitator, educator, author, activist, and actor. Ever the activist for the environment and Indigenous rights, Gitz is known for his leadership and participation in the Idle No More movement, one of the largest Indigenous mobilizations in Canadian history. His novel, Secret of the Stars, has caught the attention of national and international media such as the CBC and Australia's Indigenous radio station. He has spent most of his life learning and living with different Indigenous nations all over the world and incorporates these experiences into everything he does. Currently, Gitz resides in Calgary and is actively reconnecting with his Blackfoot roots. You can check out more about him on gitzcrazyboy.com. And just one final thing, if you require the live transcript, there's a button on the bottom of your screen. It says live transcript CC, just click her on. And if you have any issues, please type it in the comment section and I will talk you through it. I'm going to pass it over to Gitz. Oh, it's still muted.
Unmute. Is that better?
Yes, thank you.
Okay. Okiniksukwa. Nistu Nidanako Baksikoi. Nistu Gitz Crazyboy. Numukhtutu Pikani ki Mohkinstsis ki Athabasca. Ninda Anasta Thichuk. Nixista Anasta Isapaki. My name is Gitz Crazyboy. I am Siksikaitsitapi and Dene. Siksikaitsitapi is more commonly known as the Blackfoot, and the Dene sides, just everyone kind of knows them as Dene. I was born in Calgary, Mohkinstsis, and we moved down to Brockett for a few years before moving up to Fort Mac, where I essentially grew up. And I graduated from there, and once I was done graduating, I spent the next 10 to 12 years traveling around with different Indigenous communities, learning from them, listening to them, hearing their stories. I've always been motivated, honestly, just by creation stories, and it doesn't really matter where you're from. I have no idea why, but I love to sit and listen to creation stories. And there is these really beautiful lessons that can help you to navigate the rest of your life. Even some people kind of write them off as primitive, and some people take solace in the Big Bang. But for myself, there's overlaps. But there's things that you'll get from the Siksikaitsitapi creation story that you're not going to find anywhere else on the planet. And there's things that are included in our creation story that isn't in the Big Bang Theory. And for me, it just kind of makes sense. it helps me to root myself. So when I go to stay and live and work with other Indigenous people in their nations, I would just often sit down and listen to their stories, or I'd go and help out with ceremony. And then as a guest, everything is so different and new. So you just really have to sit there and hopefully you don't screw up, and you like kind of sit on your like, and this really awkward, you're kind of sitting down there awkwardly because everybody's speaking a different language. And in the back of my mind, I'm always thinking, God, I hope they don't ask me to help out or do something. Like, I'm just comfortable here. And every now and then they'll ask you to help out. And sometimes you mess up and sometimes you don't. But afterwards, when you sit with the knowledge keepers, you sit with the elders, you sit with people who are really familiar with ceremony, they'll break it down for you. And there's a whole other level of learning that comes afterwards. And I've been really very fortunate to meet some really cool people. My main focus has been working with youth and in this realm of education. So finding a different way for us to really learn. And that's what we're going to be doing today, because there's a lot of like Indigenous myths, a lot of things out there that we've normalized. We'll actually talk about the normalization, hopefully before I like ramble on too long and we run out of time. But normalization is such an interesting thing in this country. So if anybody has any questions, you can hit the chat box. There'll be a time to do some Q&A. So that's me. So are we is anybody else that's on the panel introducing themselves, or is it just me for right now?
Sorry, I have it on different view. Yeah, just you, but Stacey will be available to support you in the Q&A section as you wish.
Okay, and I just got to set my timer. How much time do we have?
Give her a heck.
Give her a heck, okay.
Yeah, like maybe 2 hours with questions, but over, under, it's totally up to you.
Okay, cool. All right, so I'll just keep that in mind. Gonna need a screen share in just a sec. When I get it lit up, hold on. So one of the things I love learning, the more I learn about my people, and I gotta tell you, I was raised as a Catholic. Both my parents went to the residential schools. They both survived the residential schools. They both had friends and relatives who died while they were at residential schools. My mother she went to 2 different residential schools, which is like the shittiest thing you can imagine. And as well as like her sisters and my uncles on that side of my family. I think they're going to start doing those ground sonar this week in Pikani. And from the stories that my mom has told me, there's probably going to be like a mass grave or a place where they buried all the kids. And so the impact is already happening. The impact happened because they've always been talking about the mass graves as a kid. And when I was growing up in the late 80s, early 90s, in my mind, I thought they were liars, because when we learned about like World War II and the liquidation of the Jewish people, mass graves are one of those things that nobody denies. And if they deny, they totally get cut down right away. But my folks would tell me about that. They would say that there was a lot of kids that would be sent home, and they never sent kids home, like just to send them home. Or this person ran away and they would never return back to the school, and they never made it home. The odd times that the school actually did send a kid home was when they were dying and there was nothing they could do. My grandmother on my mom's side was sent home when she was just a little kid. And my grandma had one eye. The other eye was all milky colored. And we always wondered how that happened. And she would tell a story when we were kids that she like got hit by like a rock when she was like in her teens, and that took out her eye. But then we found a really, really old residential school photo of her in the little uniforms. And the first thing I looked at was her eye, and it was gone. Even as a kid, it was gone. My grandmother never, ever talked about her experience. My mom at different times would, but my grandma never did. She got sick. And I'll say this now, and then I'll give the context of it later. So my grandma got sick, and they sent her home to die. She had some kind of infection in her lungs, and there was nothing they could do. Her health was just going down. They sent her home with maybe like a week to live because she wasn't holding down foods, nothing. There was nothing they could do. And they saw this specific thing with kids happen. So my grandma had sisters and brothers and cousins and friends. And around the same time, when it started getting a little colder, a bunch of them started getting sick and they all died. My grandma, they sent her home. She sat with one of our, she went home and everybody on the res was sad when they'd see a kid come home. The truck would come and they drop one of the kids off and the kids would have to walk home. But everybody knew once the school season was in and they dropped a kid off, that kid didn't have much long to live. Or they were like, they got fucked up. They seriously disfigured. They could no longer be mobile. Like there was never a good reason to see a kid during school. So they sent her home and there was a serious problem with her lungs. And she went to go see this. They brought a medicine man to the house to try we say his doctor to help her. And he knew herbs, like he knew a lot of different herbs and roots. And he had this concoction for lungs that they would give to horses. And they gave that to her. And the man said, you take her and you have to make her walk like a really long distance and bring her home. You make tea, she drinks it. You take her out, she comes back. And she did that. They did that every day for, I think, about a month. And in the beginning, she'd only take a few steps, come back, got further and further and further. And eventually she was okay. Her lungs were horrendously damaged, though, and they would bother her and affect her until the day that she died. And as she got older, she had to depend on those little portable oxygen machines. And that was her. I think about that because my grandma's peers had died. Her cohort had the same thing, died. For whatever reason, she lived. Blessings, prayers, luck, if you don't believe in those. She lived, and then she had children and my mom. That was on my mom's side. Now, on my dad's side, my grandfather had a family, and my grandfather lived like way up north. It was remote, and he would go hunt. He was a hunter and he was a trapper and he was an explorer. He traveled northern Alberta, northern Saskatchewan, northern Manitoba, all the way to the Barren Lands up in the Northwest Territories. And he would trade. He would go and he would hunt and he would trade. And he knew some of the Inuit people and they knew him. And my cousin she married this man from northern Manitoba. They're still together. And she got to sit in some ceremonies with some older Cree and older Dene men, and they would tell stories of my grandpa, this man who came from the west, and they didn't quite know his name, but she would tell them that was my grandpa. His name was Baba. Sickness came through, and it hit my grandpa. No, sorry, my grandpa went out into trapline. It hit his family. They used to live in micro villages. And there was a well-trodden trail that would take you to the village and where they lived. But as he was coming home, there was a man that was waiting there. And he didn't know what to make of it. And so when he got within like shouting distance, the man told him to stop. And he didn't know why. And he said everyone in the villages got sick. And everyone in the village died. My grandpa had a family, he had a wife, he had kids, and they all died. And just like that, he left, came back, he had all this food, he had everything. They quarantined the village. And my grandpa's original family had died, just completely rubbed out. So he had friends and people that he fed, and there was this one family that really liked my grandpa. And they saw how broken he was for the loss of his wife and his kids, that they arranged a marriage for their daughter with my grandpa. Although their daughter was in love with another man, even though she was just a kid, she fancied this other guy. So they had this arranged marriage, and every now and then she'd run away. She'd run away from my grandpa, and she'd go seek out her parents, and then she'd try to find this man that she was in love with. And every time they found her, they brought her back. And that woman turned out to be my grandma. And then they had a whole bunch of kids. Not a lot of them lived. And then my dad was born, met my mom. I want to say there was like a romantic story, like him wooing my mom, but he literally just kept asking her out until she said yes. She just kept saying no and shooting him down, and eventually said, "Okay, fine, I'll go out with you." And then that was it. Once he locked it in, that was it. He wasn't letting go. And he promised her the world. He would say, "I'll take you to I'll take you to Tokyo," because my mom really wanted to go to Tokyo, and he never did. He never did. But yeah, then they had us. And I look at these stories, and I when I go travel, I ask about their stories, and it's pretty similar of sickness and disease and people dying. And then you hear these stories from white people, and they tell themselves, well, those Indians just got sick. They couldn't really handle our diseases, and they just got sick and died. They couldn't handle the common cold or the flu. And there's some truth to that. But there's also a history they don't tell you. And we're going to jump into a little bit of science. So if anybody gets a little lost, I'll explain this a little further, because once I started learning about this concept called biodiversity, it really, fundamentally, it's one of the principles that the Blackfoot, the Siksikaitsitapi live by, and also the Dene live by, and also the Nehio, which is commonly known as the Cree, and also the Mohawk and Haudenosaunee. Every Indigenous nation I came across, one of their fundamental philosophies and beliefs was actually biodiversity, which is an intricate webbing of life. Is there like a screen share? Share screen. Oh, host disabled participant screen sharing. Okay, I'm the host now. Thank you. So I'll bring up one image and I'll show you another image really quickly. Let me just open this up. And then you tell me if you can see it or not. You can see that? Yeah, okay. All right, so each of these webs connects to something, all right? So if you were just to follow one of these horizontally, that web at its base would be a plant species or a water species. The plant species generally is where all life starts, plants and water. The more plant species, diverse plant species in an area, the healthier the system is for disruptions. So if you look at this, like if you look at a plant, it could be anything. Let's say like a pine tree. It's not just a pine tree. It's not just a tree. There is a diverse application that it has to all life. And it's not just the one thing. It's like there's a whole bunch of things that can be extrapolated from it. Obviously, oxygen, because we have a relationship with it. That is, we have this relationship and we have no idea that it's there all the time. Even as kids, we don't know that we're constantly in a, this, we breathe out carbon, it breathes in carbon, it exhales oxygen, we inhale that oxygen. There's this dynamic. And people would say like, oh, that's just a tree. But if you look at the tree, it has many different functions. It could be a home. It could be building blocks for your house as a human being, your house, or if you're an animal, building blocks to their homes. It could be a source for them to hide in, but there's multiple things about just one plant species. Plant species all work together in one form or another. So if like willows, the little buds from it, those are eaten by certain animals. Generally, it's a food, a medicine. If you want to break it down, like every plant species kind of falls into these three categories: a food, medicine, or shelter, along with giving us air. These are the three things that it's used by. Either by insects, and that's where you begin to connect this web as it goes around. So you have like, let's say a willow. A deer would eat that willow. Okay, so this is the basic one. Something eats that deer, another predator. Let's say it's a cougar. The cougar then dies from old age. It's consumed by, or it's broken down rather, by an insect species. Begins to eat away these maggots. There's another species that's also connected to that. Bacteria, everything else begins to really break it down, turn it into dust, and it goes back into the earth. Each one of these in the web of life connects. So one of these strands could be like a plant. It could be like a pussy willow. The other one could be a pine tree. Another one could be a poplar tree. But each of these has a diverse connection that we know about and that we don't know about. So when you really begin to look at like a web of life, and the more we begin to look at science and the more our technology begins to advance, what the web ends up looking like is something like this one right here, which is like super intricate. And I just love this picture. Where it begins and ends, like I have no idea. But to say like a single blade of grass is super important to the ecosystem around it is true. Because it all feeds off of one another. It's all interconnected, whether it's human beings, whether it's animals, whether it's insects, they all work together. When a species begins to die off, generally, well, like now it's through people. People are expanding in areas and they're destroying all of biodiversity. They're interrupting migration patterns. This has an adverse effect on this web. It begins, the more complex this web is, okay, if you're looking at it, the healthier a system is. So the more plant species that's in a system, like a natural plant species, not an invasive species, although invasive species will eventually find some kind of homeostasis after like a while. But if you have all indigenous plants from one area and they're all super intricate, that system, that area is super healthy. It can sustain and maybe even create life. So if you look at this, this is intricate. If you have something that's way more intricate than that, that's a really healthy ass place to live. That's where you want to go. That's a place that you want to protect because there's medicines for us. There's building blocks of life. There's everything depends on this. But I love this picture so much because it reminds me of what life could be like. There's things that we have no concept of, no idea, no rationale, no expression in the English language to help you conceptualize this, but it's there. My ancestors knew of this. Siksikaitsitapi people didn't believe in man's dominion over all things. We saw ourselves as an extension and as a part of the system. The burden that we have and we carry through our stories is that we could fuck this system up so bad. And we did in the past. And then there was a renewal that had happened. But our relationship was knowing how much we didn't know. The Lakota Dakota people call it Wakantanka, which is like the great mystery, the sacred mystery. And most people like consider that, oh, they're just talking about a deity. They're God, the great mystery. There is that part, but there's also the thing that we just have no concept of that. What it really is, what it really looks like. But that translates right back to the earth because we don't know, honestly, we don't know how intricate the system is, even by today's standards. There's a scientist named E.O. Wilson. He's got some pretty cool documentaries you can check out for free on YouTube. He's got some pretty cool books, but he often talks about the web of life and bacteria strains. There's about I think it's like 400 different bacteria strains in your mouth, your throat, and your stomach. Bacteria can be considered as a bad thing and it could kill you, but there is a relationship we have with bacteria, the one that's in our mouth, in our throat, and in our stomach. Helps to protect us, keep us alive, breaks these things down. I think he was saying, I got to remember this because I haven't read this up in like a while. I've been dealing with a bunch of other shit that's going to play into what we're talking about. But I believe he said about a gram of topsoil. In your hands has, I think, like 1,000 different species or types of bacteria. But if you go to a ton, there's over millions and millions of different bacteria strands. And how much we know about these bacteria strands, we don't. We're still discovering them and what they mean. The interesting thing is you can pick up like a gram of topsoil and have all of this foreign bacteria and it doesn't kill you. It's actually keeping you alive. But it's also keeping the rest of the world alive. It's keeping insects alive. It's keeping plant species alive. But we don't know how like all this stuff really works, like even today. So I go back to this thing that we're looking at right now, this biodiverse web of life. And how my people had the burden of knowing that we don't know like what it really is. So our direction that we were given was really to just observe, to try to protect it and not disrupt this web of life too much. We knew that there was a thing, if you killed too much of one, like there was an adverse effect. If you killed a species out, it would affect everything else. You would be scolded. You'd be scolded by your people and your community if you overhunted anything. If you took too much buffalo, if you took too much like deer or moose, and that meat went to waste. Waste was one of the things that was like one of our, I hate to say the word sin, but it was just a disgusting thing to do, because that was life. It might have been like dead meat, but if that was just to like rot away and no one was to eat it, that was considered like a really disgusting act, because that thing that you just let rot away was life. It lived, it breathed, it had a purpose. And you, as a person, as a greedy, selfish person who overhunted, you completely obliterated that life force. And so we didn't, that was one of the things that we never really wanted to partake in. So, the name of the man is E.O. Wilson. He's this old dude and he's super cute. I look at him as like a white elder when he starts talking about the intricacies of biodiversity. So I'll just stop sharing this. I needed this as a preface for this next part, because when we talk about like Indigenous myths, one of the myths that we have is that Indigenous peoples were just, our immune system was just so weak, was just so bad that, I'm going to turn this way. There we go. Our immune systems were so bad that we couldn't survive certain influenzas. We just get sick and then we would just die. There is some truth to that, you know, like when you introduce an invasive anything into an area, there's always going to be these things that happen. So introduce an invasive species, a plant species, that plant species could eventually just take over that area, and it's dangerous. Same thing with like foreign diseases. Our bodies aren't used to fighting them, but there was outside factors that a lot of people don't talk about. Oh, sorry, just making you the host. Is that better? Okay. I'm going to need to be host again in just like a second. So yeah, the idea that we were just sick, we couldn't handle a cold. We couldn't just bundle up and crawl into our teepees and be okay in like 2 or 3 days. There was an outside factor to this. So we'll go with what's kind of being more commonly known. If I can get the host again, because I got to do some screen shares. Okay. So what's commonly being known right now, it's finally making like, it's finally coming out there, which is great. But this is generally where the story starts and ends for colonizers, is the buffalo, especially with the Plains Indigenous folks. So those that were in the Plains, this is one of our staple food groups, the buffalo. And they were hunted into extinction. For us, the buffalo that you see in front of you was our source of life. It provided food, clothing, shelter, and lessons about life. Being guided by some sacred teachings, being guided by like spiritual ceremonial teachings coming from the buffalo. The Dakota people talk about the white buffalo calf, the white buffalo calf woman who brought ceremonies to them. And I'm not Lakota or Dakota, so I'm not going to get into that. But if you look at this, there was so many things that come out of it. And if you want to strip away spirituality, and which you're totally free to do, like if you don't think there's anything out there, if you want to look at this as like deifying an animal, like you're deifying the buffalo here. Why would they do that? Well, nations deify things that they find important. So they would evolve into a state of thinking of something spiritual, something much more. I am not an atheist. I don't believe in like one deity. I don't believe in just a creator. But I do look at this from the spiritual context as well, that there was some serious, beautiful gifts this creature given to us. Unfortunately, when we had white people come in, and I'm going to say like white people. And if you don't like it, I don't know what to tell you. Like, hold on one second. You can see this new image. Okay. The Canadian government systematically attacked the buffalo based on data they had gotten from the United States. The United States would be trying to wage a war on Indigenous folks. They thought that they could run us over with like their advanced military, with their advanced weaponry. And they found that they really couldn't. What they would do is they'd enter a village when all the men were gone hunting, and they would lay waste to all the women, the children, the elders that were there. And these are like horrific acts of genocide. Like they killed these they make bonfires. They would throw live babies into the bonfires, Indigenous babies. They would rape and they would murder the women. They would murder the elders. They were under specific orders, and one of them were mitts make mice. That's what the soldiers were told, that the little babies, little mitts, were going to turn into mice, and they need to be exterminated as well. So they would bash these babies' heads in. You know, it's really fucked up. What happened then? Unfortunately, there was a recourse. Unfortunately for all like the soldiers, the Indigenous men would get together and they'd fight them. It all came to a head with Custer, and Custer had an interesting like duality. He fought to free the slaves, and then his next campaign after that was to cleanse the plains of all the Indian people. Some people thought he was trying to do that to run for president. Unfortunately, he pissed off enough Lakota, Dakota, and surrounding nations with the way he was killing people. But they all got together and they just straight up slaughtered the 7th Cavalry. So what they did was they changed their tactics to hunting and killing all the buffalo. And they said within like 15 years, or it was like within like a few years, we'll do more damage to these Indigenous peoples or these Indian peoples by killing off their livestock than the army has done in like the last 15. So the interesting thing about these slides, these are from Canada. As you can see, the Canadian Pacific Railroad. What they did was they didn't just leave these skulls there. They were there for a while, but they're used for transportation. They were ground up and they were used for fertilizer, or they were used for some fine china. So if you have any plates that are around or older than 1877, or around 1877-ish, 1870, 1877, there's a good chance that that bone china that you have is actually buffalo, our ancestors. Once the buffalo were all depleted, they were able to starve the Indigenous peoples into submission. And it's like the best way to win a war. Europeans, this is like an old European tactic. That's why castles had moats. So when they were invaded, they couldn't invade the castle itself. If you were doing a siege on a castle, you just had to kind of wait until either their food ran out before your food. And if you're able to starve your enemy out, there was no real battle. It'd be like some shit that'd be shot at your castle. But if they couldn't cross the moat, there was no way they were getting in. Starvation is a very, very powerful tool when it comes to colonizing peoples. So once all the buffalo were gone, we had nothing really to eat. Our will was essentially broken by the Canadian government. This was planned. And as a result, our immune systems began to drop. Our natural immune systems began to drop. Not a lot of people know this because they don't really talk about it, but buffalo itself there was times of stress. Just in the course of a buffalo's life, if there was like a really hard winter or if there was like droughts, there'd be stress. And eventually a type of anthrax that's very similar to like cow anthrax would pop up. And then our people would get that and they would get sick. Blackfoot people used to be, they had some studies saying that we were the tallest people in the world. The average height of a Blackfoot man was anywhere between 7 feet to 7'6", and the average height of a Blackfoot woman was 6 feet to 6'4". I'm 6'4", so I'd be the height of a of a Blackfoot woman from way back in the day. I would be a runt as a 6'4" man back in the day. I'd be a runt, and it's because our nutrition was so incredibly diverse, but it was broken down before the buffalo died. Does anybody know why? I will put this to like the group. There was the eradication of the buffalo that affected us. That was like the last fucking straw. However, prior to the buffalo dying, and this is what they don't teach you, prior to the buffalo dying, there was another species that had collapsed in the area, affecting fucking everything in the plains. Dwindling down biodiversity and destroying essentially like the building blocks of life. So let's go to the chat real quick. Yeah, who's that? Who said this? Morgan, give yourself a pat on the back. It is the beaver. Let's bring the beaver up. Just bring the beaver. It's like they're such beautiful creatures. The beaver were hunted to extinction or near extinction or extinction in certain areas due to the trades, the fur trades. They don't really talk about this, the adverse effects. Beavers can affect water systems. They create dams. They can create new water systems. Why I bring this up is because the water systems that these beavers had naturally created within the plains were utilized by buffalo, by rabbits, by deer, by everything. You could transverse the plains when there was a lot of beaver in the area because they would create water systems. There might have been like droughts, but they weren't that dangerous. There's like clean water, way more river systems, way more lakes at the time than we have now. And you think about that, there's a whole shitload of lakes in Manitoba. There's a bunch of rivers and lakes down in South Dakota, North Dakota, Minnesota, Montana, Alberta. There are a bunch of lakes and rivers, but back then there was way more because we had an abundant amount of beaver, which means since there was river and there was water, there was life. There was plant species. When we go back to what I was telling you earlier, each plant species was either a medicine, a food, or shelter that insects, animals, and man could use. So the more river systems and clean river systems, the more everything could be utilized. Fur trades changed all that though, and they eventually killed all the beaver. If you look at the time around, like I think it's like the late 1800s, the late 1870s, late 1860s, they talk about a massive drought. And all the white people, like when you look at, they just don't know where it came from. But that came from the destruction of the beaver. When the beaver left, droughts were going to come either way. But when you destroy, and when I talk about like systems, if you have the beaver in an area and they're diverting water to your area and you have a drought, the beaver are beneficial for that area. So when a drought hits you, it doesn't hit you as hard. But if you take the beaver out of that area, it dries up all the water systems. So when a drought does hit you, it's 10 times worse because these little beautiful creatures, they're not as impactful in the beneficial way. They're gone, and they were gone in the area. So animals began to collapse along with the beaver when the beaver began to die. And the buffalo were holding on, but the way that they can migrate across the plains was severely reduced. Water systems that they could drink from were no longer there. So they couldn't go as far as they could. When buffaloes would run in a herd together, my ancestors would say it was like a thunderstorm coming in. So you'd hear this thunderstorm. But what that would do to the earth itself is when it would run, is it would circulate the earth. So the topsoil that was on top, that was being depleted of nutrients, would begin to travel to the bottom. And the things that were on the bottom would begin to be carried up to the top. That is a system. That's a system that is feeding itself and that's retaining itself. Just having buffalo run in a herd was cycling the nutrients within the soil. And I think that's like, to me, that just like fucking totally blows me away. If you think about all these water systems, because everything connects. So if they were able to run from fucking the mountains in the Rockies and they were able to run all the way to I don't know, Minnesota, like Fargo. I'm gonna go this way now because I'm just all in sunspots. I feel like I'm in a Is that a little better? Is that better? I feel pasty white. Like I feel like this and this are browner than me. Like I feel like I'm in a J.J. Abrams movie with all those freaking sunspots. I'll just check chat real quick so I'm not losing anybody. I'll stop the share and I'll give it back to you, but then I'm gonna need it back again, okay? I have the best idea. Yeah, so I mean, if you could, like, what's really cool about traveling to nations, there, if I sit like that, I think it'll work. What's really cool, no, I gotta lean forward. What's really cool about traveling and sitting with nations and hearing their creation stories is you begin to hear stories about like their deities, their holy people, their holy animals. So you get, if you go to the plains, and you really want to learn about something, ask about the stories about the beaver. They'll have really old stories about beaver and their importance. And if you don't believe in God, and you're totally allowed to do that, you can see how some nations deified the beaver because they had a super importance. So once the beaver were gone, biodiversity began to be affected. And once the buffalo were gone, again, biodiversity was severely affected. So what my people could normally eat weren't there anymore. There are stories of Indigenous folks who, let's get this closer. There's stories of Indigenous folks who were starving on the res, and they were forced to eat gophers. And some people laugh at that, like, oh, your people were so poor, they ate gophers. Why couldn't they just eat deer? Well, they couldn't. The deer's migration patterns were severely affected because of the loss of the beaver. They weren't as bountiful as they were. They had a harder time trying to survive because the water systems that were in place for thousands and thousands and thousands and thousands and thousands and thousands and thousands of generations were gone. So what did they have to eat? Well, the things that would survive, which would, in this case, would be gophers. Prairie dogs. And this is what I find super interesting about white people and Indigenous peoples. When we starved, we would eat like our moccasins, we would eat the sinew from our clothes, and then we would starve to death. When white people and settlers starved, there's so many fucking stories of them eating each other, even eating their kids. Like, I have a daughter, I couldn't imagine like eating my child. I also can't imagine, and I don't want to ever be in a space where we're all starving to death. So was it just the destruction of the beavers and just the destruction of the buffalo that made Indigenous peoples starve? Or was there something more sinister behind it? Because now we've removed and destroyed biodiversity. The biodiversity was severely destroyed, with our staple food being the buffalo being depleted again, and our immune system's just dropping like crazy, because that's what happens when you're starving. Your body has nothing to go on, it has nothing to fight, so even the common cold will kill you, which is when our immune systems began to get so weakened. So was there something sinister? Was it just the fact that on accident the beavers were all killed, and then on accident the buffalo were killed? No. Beavers, there might be an argument for beavers being an accident, just the effect of like overhunting for the fur trades, but the buffalo were definitely systematically exterminated. But even so, was there another outside factor adding to the starvation of Indigenous peoples? Does anybody want to answer? Take a shot. Was there any outside force that might have been effectively promoting starvation, celebrating the starvation of Indigenous peoples? there was Dr. Bryce. Well, not you could say white people. I mean, and you could say white people because the liberals definitely didn't help. They have never helped us. And the conservatives have always been like the fucking worst people to Indigenous folks and people of color and minorities. The conservative government under John A. Macdonald had full intentions to plan to start Indigenous peoples into submission. And I think about this a lot. Did he know that it was that bad, or was it just some fucking wordplay that they were having? You can look up all of these things too in the minutes from because they would record the minutes of Parliament, but you can actually look at the minutes of all the shit that John A. Macdonald said, who was Prime Minister at the time and also the head of Indian Affairs for Canada. His intention was to starve the Indians into submission. Did he know how bad it was, though? There was a guy named Dr. Bryce who wrote a report on this. And he talked about how we were starving, how we needed food, how the rations that they were giving were spoiled, the conditions of the residential schools, the survival rate of the residential schools, the death rate of the residential schools, because they were starving the people in the residential schools, and they knew they were starving the people in the residential schools. They fucking knew back then how bad it was. And they also knew how bad it was going to be. And they changed nothing. You have never heard of this report by Dr. Bryce because John A. Macdonald, after reading it, he buried it. Didn't make it a point to follow up on any of Dr. Bryce's recommendations. He would be like one of the first whistleblowers we had about Indigenous, like just the peril that Indigenous peoples were in. So once we were starving when the buffalo were gone, and when we signed treaty in 1877, as like Treaty 7, we had a clause in there for the buffalo because we thought the buffalo were going to last for another, like at least another 10 years. And if we began to conserve when we signed the treaties in 1877, we would prolong the life of the buffalo and ourselves. Within a year, the buffalo were completely gone. We didn't know that as Siksikaitsitapi people. And I don't think the government quite knew either. Well, let's get to the rations. So there's a wonderful book that's not mine that I would encourage you to pick up before you buy my book. And it's called Claiming the Plains. There is a man named James Daschuk. He's worked a lot with Siksikaitsitapi people in our area. And he even has like, he's has some shout outs by some elders in our area for the work that he's done on the book. He covers this way, way, way more in depth. And it's a really insane, tragic read to have. But the idea that Indigenous peoples had no immunity is a complete illogical fallacy. We did have immunity. We had some of the best foods to eat. We had some of the best nutritions for our bodies. Blackfoot people being like 6'4" or 6'4" for women, 7 feet and above for men. Yeah, and within a couple of generations, from 1877 to 1984, going from 7 feet to 6'4" shows the impact of nutrition. But like I said, Johnny McDonald knew, and they calculated the death rate for those that were in the residential schools. Like he knew, which means he knew exactly what was going to happen to my grandma and her cohort and her peers, and he chose to do nothing about it. The celebration of Indigenous folks dying is one of the things that Johnny McDonald relished in. There's a photo of Crowfoot with his 8 kids. And Crowfoot had a few wives, but he had like 8 kids in this one photo. I think it's in here. And the set, like you look at it, and it's an iconic photo. If you've ever seen photos of like Crowfoot, unfortunately, everybody in that photo was dead within 2 years from sicknesses, from starvation. Here it is. You can see this one online. But those are his kids, and his kids all died within 2 years, and himself later on. And this was a direct result of the policies carried out by the conservative government. So we had the death of the beaver, we had the death of the buffalo, but then we had what they calculated on us. Now, they did offer rations. The ration houses were full. Some of the rations they had brought up, and this is how fucked up like settlers are and colonizers. The dude that they had in charge of rations was getting his food. It was really weird. I don't know why they focused on bacon so much. I guess because it could travel. He would buy he had a deal from a dude in the States, and then he would upcharge Canada, and he was making fucking hand over fist money because he had to feed all these reservations. And then when the bacon would spoil, all he would do was just recure it with more salt, and then he would give it to the Indigenous folks to eat. And it gets more fucked up than that because a lot of the rations that they got were rotten or rotting. And again, this was brought up in the report by Bryce and Johnny McDonald. Like, we can't feed these Native peoples this food that's gone bad. And Johnny McDonald's response to that was like, beggars can't be choosers. So he knew that we were getting bad food. He just chose not to fucking help. He knew that we were getting like shitty food. That was his response was, beggars can't be choosers. I don't know of a bigger piece of shit in Canadian history that was prime minister. And I know there was like, we've had super racist folks, like racist men that were in parliament, but to actively carry out genocide on Indigenous peoples, I don't think we had that to that level as Johnny McDonald. There's one more thing I want to get to about the food and the rations, you know, because this is a story that's not really talked about. The men, and it was always men, always white men that were in charge of the ration house. They would exploit starvation of Indigenous peoples by sexual advances and the rape of Indigenous women. So the guys that were in charge of the ration houses were raping Indigenous women. They were coercing, and I don't even say they were the coercion of like, you either we fuck or you starve. And then what do they get in the end? Terrible fucking food. There were times where our people got so pissed that they would raid the ration houses. And that thing I was telling you earlier about a disgusting practice of like wasting food, they only took what they needed. They didn't ransack the whole ration house and take everything. They only took what they needed. I always think about that, even during starvation. There were some papers that they had written out of, I think it was Saskatchewan, back in the day when we were being colonized onto reservations. And James Daschuk talks about this in some of his lectures. They were just like written up as a headline. Another 5 Indigenous people starved to death. Like, the narrative that they created wasn't like, oh my God, another 5. It was like, yeah, so 5 more Indigenous peoples from this reservation starved to death. And that was it. No like cry for a policy change or anything. It was just like, oh, reporting that. Yeah. By the way, it's also going to rain on Thursday. And that same kind of candor. So one of the myths white people tell themselves is that it was their military power that destroyed the Indigenous peoples and beat us into submission. The advanced weaponry was a thing that had destroyed us. In one sense, that's true. The advanced weaponry was able to kill animals, was able to kill all the buffalo, and was able to kill all the beaver. And these two things that had happened, and like other animals like suffered in the way. I know there was like a really interesting bird they had on the East Coast that couldn't fly, and settlers have these journals about this funny looking bird. So they just used it as target practice until there was nothing fucking left. You know, the Indigenous peoples could have killed that, but they didn't. They saw and they knew that thing, whatever it was, played a vital role, and that they didn't want to waste meat because they didn't want to kill the life force. But their weapons, it was their weapons that killed all these animals. It wasn't wasn't that their weapons killed us. They did, but it was used to kill everything, like just the animals and whatever else. So yeah, before I jump to the next thing, do you have any questions? Well, I mean, when you say ancestral trauma, when I begin to learn, like you, so if you're not Indigenous and you learn about this, it doesn't really affect you that much. You're like, oh fuck, well Johnny was a terrible guy. He starved the Indians. He knew how bad it was, and that's just like a thing. But for me, it's like, well, yeah, my grandma almost died in the schools because she wasn't being fed properly, and they knew that she wasn't being fed properly. What was their solution? To feed them better? No, it was to send her home to die. Like that's the thing that really fucks me up about it. And all these stories are echoed throughout Turtle Island. So it's not just my family. I think about genocide in the terms of like, I should have more cousins out there. My grandmother shouldn't have outlived some of her friends in the schools. They should have all just went to school and graduated and not have been placed into these places where there's fucking serial rapists and serial murderers just running rampant and free. Yeah, the Beuthuks were genocided. They're right to extinction. This is the chat. So if you know what I'm saying, if you look at the chat, they ask about the Beuthuck in Newfoundland. I can't say that they were all like murdered into like genocide, but the nations that they had were broken down. I don't know if because I would think that some of the Beuthuks would just head west once they saw how fucking crazy white people were and marry in and become part of those communities. I think that there's some remnants left. I wouldn't say, and even before, just naturally, before white people, we were always intermarrying within our nations because you can't. We're not. I always say this in every fucking presentation I do. We're not the monarchy. We're not the royalty. We don't believe in banging our cousins and keeping the bloodline pure. As Siksikaitsitapi, mom is na'a, auntie is na'a, her kids. If your mom is na'a and your auntie's na'a, their kids would be your brothers and your sisters. We have a word for like close relations, but you wouldn't bang your mom's kids because it's just fucking weird. So what we would do is once the gene pool started getting too close is we would leave. Either we would leave to go find a wife and bring her back, or we would join their community. Now, the beautiful thing about Siksikaitsitapi people is if you came to the community, you were treated better than the community members themselves. That was just one of the things. So we would do raids for women, not like Vikings. We would go and we would steal a wife and bring her back. And if she had kids, those kids had to come. But if she wanted to go back, then you had to bring her back. And if you went and you stole a kid, and the kid was so heartbroken, you actually had to bring the kid back. And you had to do that shit on your own. So if you pissed off those people and you were like, I got to go bring these people back, there was it could almost be a death march, but you had to do that. Because, and then when you're adopted into the community, you're no longer you're no longer an outsider. You're now na'a. If you're a woman, you're now a mother of the nation. You have sisters that'll fucking back you up. So yeah, Beuthuks, once they got to a certain point with their gene pool, they would leave out and get married, and they would bring people back, or they would go. So I don't know if all the Beuthuks are just completely genocided, but the nation themselves was destroyed by the colonizers coming in. So yeah, to answer the question about the Beuthuks, do I think Cabot? Cabot was a pedophile. Cabot married a 12-year-old Indian girl, or 11 or 12-year-old Indian girl. And they might have actually aged her up when they were writing it down, but Cabot took a little Indian girl's wife. I said this, and I got in shit in school. I think it was in grade 7 when they said, "Oh yeah, John Cabot found Newfoundland. He married an Indian girl that was 12." And I was like, "Isn't that like a pedophile?" And I got kicked out of class for saying that, so I kept saying it. I was John Cabot, pedophile. John Cabot is a pedophile. But yeah, he was a warmonger. He didn't give a shit about the people. He just wanted the land. Okay, so we're at 8:10. The other one I wanted to talk about. The other one I want to talk about was MMIW. Okay, the murder and missing Indigenous women. There's a bunch of stuff I want to talk about, but These two things for me were really sticking out in my mind. And I don't have any pictures of MMIW. Just, I'm in this place right now where I think I should just say it. I don't want to bring up any photos of women that have gone missing. Because I think, and I'm struggling with this myself, I think it's kind of performative when people do it, when other Indigenous peoples do it. And there's so many of us that have connections to women who've been murdered, who've gone missing. I've been a youth worker for like a lot of my life. And some of the kids that I worked with, their moms are gone. Haven't been found. Now, there was a paper there was an article written by The Sun, a conservative paper blaming Indigenous men for it. And this was, they actually had to do a retraction on it because a lot of the shit that it said in the article was unfounded and not true. The reality is most, when women go missing, and not to say that like it doesn't happen on the res, and not to say that, you know, not to say Indigenous peoples aren't killing each other, because places that are put in poverty, controlled poverty, you have these dark elements that come in. So people do get murdered, people do murder each other. But it's not, in our community, it's not as an epidemic as it is with Indigenous women being murdered by non-Indigenous folks. And I believe out of all the people that they arrest, I think it's only about 1% get convicted. So if they, and like you look at Tina Fontaine and the guy admitting and him walking, if you look at murdered and missing Indigenous, like even boys, Colton Bouchier, his murderer walking, these stories got traction and you heard about them because our people got together and we amplified the message. But even as we amplified it, these people still fucking walked. There are tons of other stories of that don't make the news of being murdered, of that person going to trial, and then them still walking. And then there's the thing about like, well, these Indigenous women are putting themselves in those situations. I can't tell, I don't know how many fucking white girl wasted stories there are about these girls making it their way home, or they go to a house party. And not to say that there's not any like assaults that happen, because they do. And there's just the fucking most insane, unhealthy men and people out there taking advantage of anybody, any women at all. And these stories happen and they're real. But when I think about the murdered and missing Indigenous women, the one thing that nobody talks about at all, no conservatives are ever going to touch this, and liberals don't talk about this either, is that the police, the RCMP and the city police, whatever city you're in, have known about this for decades and decades. You might have just heard about this within the last 5 years because Indigenous peoples got together through Idle No More, through social movements, and brought these messages forward of murdered or missing Indigenous women. But we've known about it, and we've known about it for a really long fucking time. But the law, they've known about it for even longer, and they didn't come out with it. So you hear that thing like all cops are bastards, so they're all pigs. This is like one of those things that historically you look at and they fucking knew and they didn't do anything about it. And that makes me sick to my stomach that they knew and that they've always known, because we would go to the police when people would go missing and it would just be an unsolved case. And yes, it is true that the RCMP, and not all of them, but it is true that the RCMP do partake in the murder of these Indigenous women. And also not following up on leads, whether or not this is accidental or purposefully, we don't know until there's investigations done with them. But it's a thing that the RCMP have done. I don't know to what degree, if it's like, if it's an epidemic, like if it's a whole shitload of them that just don't talk about, or if it's just a few of what they call bad apples that just somehow never get talked about, never get disciplined. And if you know about these bad apples and you're a police officer and you're not doing shit about it, you're just as fucking bad. And so those guys, the bad officers, are definitely fucking pigs in every sense of the word. And they're the reasons why we don't trust the police. However, for those that remain silent on that little fucking blue line they talk about, if you don't do anything and you don't report, and you're not reining these guys in, and you're not making sure that they get fired, you're just as fucking bad as them, because you're on the side of silence. And on the side of silence, again, this has been decades and decades and decades of knowing about these murdered and missing cases and doing nothing and not bringing it to any attention. So you might have just heard about this just recently, within the last 5 years, and I know a lot of conservatives are fucking tired of hearing about it and they just want to blame Indian people, but the police have always known. I'll say this again, the police have always known. And for them to say otherwise they must be just fucking terrible at their jobs then, if they go through their case history and they have these people filing reports of murdered or missing Indigenous women. For them to overlook that, if they honestly don't know, then they shouldn't be police officers at all. It's like you're a fucking principal of a school, and your kids in record numbers are just going missing, and you're like, well, I didn't know. They fucking know. They've always known. And there's a part of me that thinks and believes that they've been pushing it under the rug for such a long time. And we're not going to have these answers until there's a proper inquiry into the RCMP, which Trudeau on the Liberal side isn't an advocate of. And the Conservatives are definitely not going to fucking do it. I think there's one more before we get into this, before we get into the other part. Any questions on that? You can just throw it in. I think it's over there. Wherever your screen is, it's either be on this side or that side of the chat box. I don't really trust the CBC though. The CBC has an Indigenous section. I don't really trust the CBC. Just because of how complacent they've been. I mean, like, news organizations would know this too if they actually did their job properly. This should have been an investigative whistle fucking in the 80s, in the 70s, you know, but it wasn't. You have the cops, you do have the cops and Starlight Tours. Oddly enough, within the Indian Act, there was a specific clause where if there was an Indigenous nation that was next to a community of like 3,000 people, they could relocate the community. Or if you just didn't want an Indigenous person in your fucking community. And I think about like Claire's home, and I think about all these little towns that surround Calgary. And I think about the work that Taylor and Julia have done about bringing like Black Lives Matter. That's not my phone, that's just somebody else's. I think about the work that they've done bringing the issue of like, you know, racism into their communities. They could just go back to they say like our communities don't have that. They could just fucking ask their grandmas about how Indians were treated and how they could just like call the police to have them removed from these small towns. And they did, you know, or just fucking lynching Indigenous peoples and not being charged for it. Or how like we weren't allowed into liquor stores, or how we weren't allowed into pool halls because we weren't. And they're in these small towns and in Calgary, these laws were forcefully handled. Okay, so there was one more thing I wanted to talk about, but I don't know if you want to do the panel, because I really want to get to the questions, and I definitely been speaking a lot, and I would love to hear Stacey jump in as well. And I don't want to take up like too much more time, but there was just one really quick thing I wanted to touch on. But that one thing for me could just go until like 10. So what's your call, Julia and Stacey?
Yeah, go for it, definitely.
How about you, Stacey? You're on mute. Julia has to unmute you.
Yeah, I'm good to keep going. I have been wanting to jump in, but you're saying everything I was going to say anyway. So,
okay.
Especially around the missing and murdered Indigenous women, like that's close to home, right? It's out in BC. It's the Highway of Tears, the Picton Farm, the East Hastings. Like it's an epidemic here for missing and murdered women. one of my relations was murdered by the RCMP a year ago. Like, it's unbelievable. The Highway of Tears is still not being investigated. I think they have documented like under 20 missing or murdered women from there. The numbers upwards of in the hundreds. And I'm with you. Like, I worry when my daughter had to drive the Highway of Tears. I was worried that her car would break down and she would disappear because she's an Indigenous woman, and it's terrifying. And I know it's everywhere. And BC in particular seems to want to pretend we're a bunch of peace-loving people, and it's viciously violent to our women out here. So, but I'll pass it over.
No, how long would you say? How long have you known about the Trail of, or the Highway of Tears?
My whole life.
But when did that become like? When did you know white people kind of getting knowing?
Oh, when did I? Honestly, there's a lot of white people that still don't know. I would say. I'm a high school teacher, so my students know, but that's because I have them researching it. So most of them go home and their parents didn't know about it. So I guess maybe in the last 5 years, maybe there's been more awareness around it. I would say it's still a pretty invisible thing, and the Picton farm is not even recognized as missing, is not even recognized as murdered Indigenous women, but it is 100%. And that's another where the RCMP were informed of that farm years before they actually busted that farm. And it's still not recognized as an assault of our people. And almost every one of those women was Indigenous. So it's frustrating, and you think especially with that Picton farm, if that was a whole bunch of white women, that would be worldwide news for a long time. There would be a film made about it. There would be, you know, like it's just kind of ignored. It's like people will cry their tears for a week, and then it just disappears, and it's like our women never existed in the first place.
Yeah, it brings me to like this other thing I want to really lightly get on, because I want to include you in this dialogue. I really don't like taking up too much space. The normalization is like normalization, justification, and minimization are like the three staples for when I think about Canada and its founding philosophies. So just to normalize the genocide of Indigenous peoples, minimize and justify it. And it still continues on today. So when the report, when they apologize for residential schools, like Stephen Harper,
yeah,
another gigantic piece of shit, when he apologized for it, and they finally took some kind of responsibility about forcibly removing kids, he then went, I think it was about a month later, to the United Nations in front of the entire world and said, Canada has no history of colonization.
Yeah, his apology made me want to throw up, Gitz. Like, watching it at the time, I was ready to feel like some kind of positive emotion, and I was angry.
I really think about that, because like my grandma had died before hearing the apology. She went her whole entire life scarred from the residential schools, knowing her kids were taken to the residential schools, nothing being done about it, nothing being talked about it. And then she died that way, with Canada, knowing that Canada was looking down at her and her family, and like minimized as she grew up. And it was just like, oh, those Indians went to free schools. Like, they're all fucked up because they want to be fucked up. And then it took root even within our own people, because of Murray Sinclair, who kind of set the bar a little low by saying cultural genocide.
Yeah, it's not a cultural genocide. There's no such thing as cultural genocide, number one. Number two, we meet all the criteria of a people that have undergone genocide according to the UN's definition of it. Every single aspect of it we fall under. And it's still happening currently.
Mm-hmm. And what the normalization for me begins, like you're hearing Some of you are hearing this for the first time about mass graves in the residential schools. For some of us, we've kind of always known that this is a reality. Like I heard it as a kid, but I didn't think it was real. You know, and again, it goes like, well, it's news with like, and it should be, okay? It's news and it should be as fact with Jewish people and their mass graves. And anyone who wants to argue against that, you're a fucking moron and I hate your guts. But with us, like it's just one of those things that was minimized. And now they can't hide it anymore because it's starting to come to the surface. And we're finally able to bring our kids back home, which would be like my grandparents or my great-grandparents or my aunties and uncles, where I finally have the ability to bring them back home. And I got, this isn't hyperbole when I say my grandparents, because if you look at our language, who would ever fit that role or of the siblings, that's na'a, that's nina, that's my dad and my mom, and those people are my dad and my mom, even though we not be like blood related. Like naachsi or gaachsi, like the older people, that's the same word we would use. So when I say like bringing our grandparents home, I literally mean from a cultural viewpoint, from our conceptual understanding, that is a grandparent. Even though they might not be related by blood, they still fulfilled that role within our community, within our family. And you could ask us a bunch of Indigenous folks. Like I have a mom who is the clan mother, who's Bear Clan, for the Bear Clan in Akwesasne. And she's my mom. Like she's my mom. Okay, we're not by blood, not even by nation. I'm not even from a clan. Like I don't have a longhouse, but that's still my mom, and she still considers me her son. You know, and we have this tie. So when I said they're bringing home our grandparents, like yes, those people are coming home. Those are our children. Those are our grandparents. Even though they're not from our community, I recognize that the communities they go to, that's their grandparents. They're doing the side. They're going to be doing the radar in my community within the next couple of weeks. It's probably going to make me a fucking wreck, to be honest.
Are they? They're working on doing it in the community that my father went to residential school too, at Alberni School. And I know they're going to find graves because my father told me about them. So, but I don't know how do you deal with that when it's your own nation?
I don't know. Like these are things where like the solace is that we can bring them home. You know, that they're no longer like there, but we can bring them home. And that's it. Like that's the only justice we're gonna get. The liberals are still going to call it cultural genocide. The conservatives aren't even going to really acknowledge it. And if they do, they have to do it begrudgingly. But they don't want to say genocide. And the question I have for both the liberals and the conservatives and the NDP and everybody else is, how many mass graves do you need before you call it a genocide? If you want like sterilization, they were sterilizing Indigenous kids in residential schools as a practice. That in itself is a genocidal act. Why would you want to sterilize a child, a male or a female? I don't fucking know. Aside from you don't want these people to replicate and you want the bloodline to end with them. So this is genocide. And that's like what, if you want to do some like some land reclamation, if you want to do these like land acknowledgements, you fucking say genocide from here on in. And anybody that wants to like fight it or get into this like weird intellectual ethical space, just ask them the question, well, how many more mass graves do you need as a human being for you to call it, you know, genocide? Because for me, any other nation, you could say like, people often accuse me of being like racist against white people. If there was one fucking mass grave of white people from a school, I'd be like, that shit's genocide. I wouldn't even fight it. I wouldn't even fight people like I wouldn't even fight the definition. I would be like completely on your side. I'd be like, this shit's fucked up. I don't know what to say. I'm not going to apologize because it's not I didn't do it. I totally feel for you and I love you, but it's horrific and we need to bring this out. So like, you don't get into the space of like fighting with them. Just ask them that simple question. How many like fucking mass graves do you need? How many kids do you need to be sterilized? And when they were doing medical experiments, how many fucking kids do you need when they would do medical experiments on us? Even the fact that they're ripping kids from their homes, that's genocide.
Yeah, and they're doing sterilization out here in BC. They've busted recently in the last 6 months. They busted healthcare doing sterilizations on Indigenous women out here in BC again, like recently.
Within the last 6 months. If you didn't pick that up because the microphone cut out. Within the last 6 months.
Within the last 6 months, yeah.
They were, I think last year was Saskatchewan. And they found that there were some nurses that were sterilizing Indigenous women in Saskatchewan last year. So the shit is still going on. And the reason why it's allowed to go on and it's not scrutinized and not under like some kind of fucking magnifying glass is because we've become complacent. We've minimized what has happened to us and we justified it through using the words cultural genocide. And that's why it can exist. If you were to remove the cultural part from it and you were just to say genocide, this shit would be taken on such a deeper fucking level. But it's not.
And we as Indigenous people need to stop calling it cultural genocide too. I refer to it as genocide, period. That's all I've referred to it for years. But we've kind of been pulled into that same thing of calling it cultural genocide. And we have to use the term genocide ourselves. And when other people use cultural genocide, we need to call them out on that shit. Because
with us, we have to do it in a loving way.
yes.
But if you're a fucking colonizer, settler, like don't expect me to be polite with you at all, like at all, because I'm not going to be. With our own people, I'll do my best to be gentle, but I'm only to a certain point. But if you're a fucking colonizer or settler and you're still trying to do this bullshit argument, all gloves are off.
Yeah, there's no way of questioning it. Like, even if you look at our current, especially, well, all over the land, but if you look in Manitoba at the child welfare system, right, and they're taking babies at the hospital for no reason. Class action lawsuit against it, right? And they're just going into the hospital. Hospitals are calling before the babies are born and social workers show up at birth. And that again is part of the definition of genocide, is the removal of children from their families and their communities. And so it happened to our parents in residential school, and now it's happening to our children with child welfare. And it's just, people need to recognize it as that. Calling it cultural genocide takes the violence away from it. And it is violent, and it has to be recognized as the violence that it is.
I just want to quickly add to that. When my daughter she turns 2 tomorrow, and we had a very traumatic birth, and we need some emotional support in the hospital, like me and my wife. So they sent in, the doctor asked what we needed, and we're like, oh, this is what we need. We just need the counselor to come in so we can like talk to them about this and debrief it. So what the hospital had sent, and not the doctor, but what the hospital had sent was CFS. And CFS wanted to open up a case with us. And I remember saying, like, I remember just being really quiet and trying to end the conversation sooner than later. And then they left. And I was like, there's no fucking way we're going through CFS. Like, this is not what we asked for. We need a counselor to talk to about this traumatic experience. And once you open up the case with CFS, you're in there for a good couple of years. And then whatever bullshit reason they can come see you after, they're going to fucking come see you after. When our doctor had found out, the one who did the delivery, she was super pissed about what had happened because she asked what happened and we told her and she was upset. So they're trying to make some changes. But what this is called a birth alert. And this is what she was saying. This is what Stacey was saying. And a birth alert is before you're having your baby, or even during, or even right after you have your baby, the birth alert goes out to CFS to come and grab your kid for some bullshit reason they can make up. And they take your kids. And then you lose your kids into the system. And it's not like you lose them for like a day. You have to go through a process to get your kids back, even if you didn't do nothing wrong. I spent some time in Winnipeg with Vice, and we filmed about some of the things that were happening in Winnipeg and the birth alerts. And some months, it's like one kid per day gets taken. Like one newborn per day gets taken. Sometimes it's more than one newborn taken from the hospital. And you have these people from, the reason why they have such a high native birth population in Winnipeg is the surrounding Indigenous communities have to come in to the city to have their baby if they want to have it like in the hospital. From there, they call the police. The police and CFS come and they take their kids. So you have these people who are living in poverty, economic poverty, can't really afford a lawyer, are being bullied by the police, are being bullied by CFS, are being bullied by the hospital, and don't really know what to do because their autonomy is taken from them as soon as their child is taken from them. Even the threat of taking their kids would fuck a parent up, but they still do this. This is still happening. There's more kids taken by there's more kids in care now than there ever was during the residential schools. And during the residential schools, because of John A. Macdonald and the Indian Act, it was mandated to fucking take the kids. It was legislation to take every Native kid after a certain age, under a certain age, to these residential schools. Now think about that. There's more kids now in residential schools than there was when the policy was to take every single Indigenous kid and place them into these schools. And it's so fucked up. But like, again, when we use words like cultural genocide, when we minimize it, the exploitation is still happening. And if it's happening, like, I'll just say this one last thing, because Stacey, I really want you to jump in. If you're worried about having a birth alert, the only way that this is going to stop is we have to make it an issue. So you call your brothers, you call your uncles, and you call your family to be on standby, to come to the hospital, to help protect your kid. And think about how fucked up that is. You have to call your family to help you protect your child, your baby, from being taken from you. And a hospital. Like, this shouldn't exist anywhere. And
they can use the medication they put you on for childbirth as reason to take the child and have it listed that you are high. They can actually do that. On top of it, we live under an abduction funding model, right? And so there's more money for abducting a child than supporting a family. And there's more money for abducting an Indigenous child than a white child. That is across the board. And so it benefits Child and Family Services to abduct our children. And when your child's in the system, like you're saying, you don't just get that child back. You have to prove that you're a better parent than most average parents out there to get a child back once they're in the system. Because how many parents, if somebody just showed up their house randomly, would have a disastrous house and might not have gone grocery shopping and is frazzled from a day's work and might even have a glass of wine in their hand because it's the end of the workday, whatever. If you're involved with Child and Family Services, there's no leeway. You have to be a perfect parent, and no one's a perfect parent. And so you're set up to have your child abducted, and then you're set up to have one hell of a time getting them back, even if you're from a wealthy Indigenous family. And if you're not from a wealthy Indigenous family, then you are what? Dependent on legal aid lawyers? Like,
who are basically like throw yourself at the mercy of the court.
Yeah. And just hope that whatever judge you end up with isn't a racist asshole as well, right?
And some of my cousins and some of you fucking know this when you go to court and you have your public defender who's like, well, we'll just talk about the good things about you and we'll just throw yourself at the mercy of the court. It's like every fucking time I've gone in for my cousins or my friends, they list these things about who they are as if this is gonna like at all affect the judge who's up there who could or couldn't be like racist, just a racist piece of shit that just wants to throw another Indigenous person away. The concept was brought to me by a man named, I think his name was Larry Morrison. He passed away a few years ago, and what he said always stuck with me. There is an economy that's based on our poverty. So to keep us poor, and then they base an economy off of jobs, money. So jobs for people who are taking Indigenous kids, and then money for the foster parents or temporary foster parents that take in these Indigenous kids who aren't majority of the time Indigenous themselves. And they get more money for an Indigenous kid than they do for a non-Indigenous kid. And if you're an Indigenous person who wants to take an Indigenous kid, well, guess what? You're getting less money for that Indigenous kid than a white person would be for getting that Indigenous kid. How the fuck that works? It's called it's genocide. It's the economy that's based on poverty.
Absolutely. And the thing is when children are getting removed for no other reason than poverty, if the family had that funding that the white foster family was getting, they probably wouldn't have the same issues anymore if the abduction is based on poverty situations, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And some of these sneaky CFS motherfuckers will wait until the end of the month before you get your welfare or before you get your social services check, to come do a house check. And what they'll do is they'll come into your house when you're out of food, but you know that your food's coming in a couple of days. And their rationale is like, oh, well, they don't know how to budget.
Yeah.
And they take your kids, and they take these Indigenous kids from loving homes, and they place them into places where there is a complete break from their culture, from who they are as in their identity. I would have, I would, if it came down to it, like adopt another kid from a different part of the world if they were here. But I would know that like I would be the best Siksikaitsitapi man to try to raise this kid. But I know that I couldn't raise them from their own, no matter how good I was. And I could just, like, let's say I was like flawless. Let's say just in this, hypothetically, I'd be flawless in this scenario. I still couldn't raise them as one of their own. Like, that's not within me. That's let's say the person's from, even if they're like Mohawk, there's no way I could raise a Mohawk kid to be a Mohawk. You know, they can only get that from their own people. There's a certain kind of love, a certain kind of belonging, and a certain kind of energy that can only come from their own people. That can't be replicated from anywhere else. So even me as like a Siksikaitsitapi person, and hypothetically, in this scenario, like a flawless one, I still couldn't do that. You know, and that break of a cultural tie has so many detrimental effects to the person's mind and their spirit, if you believe in the spirit, or their heart, if you don't believe in the spirit. There's like one more thing too. Like we're at 8:40. The other thing I wanted to really quickly talk about, because I know Taylor and Julia have some of these peoples in their circles. They talk about anarchists, Marxists, socialists, and like people are Antifa. And then if you're conservative, you don't know what they are. You just say they are Antifa. But there also might be some conservatives listening to this who, when they look at Indigenous nations, they think that we're like primitive tribal individuals. And we're not. Or you have, I can't stand it. And this is one thing I really can't stand, is I'm sitting down with a Marxist who's trying to tell me that like Siksikaitsitapi people are Marxists or they're communists. I'll just say this briefly. And this comes from an amazing author, an amazing speaker, and an amazing elder, Dr. John Henrik Clarke. Watch every single one of his YouTubes, buy every single one of his books. This man is so incredibly brilliant. He's just like a divine source of knowledge. And I'll say he's a divine source of knowledge. We might live socially, but we're not socialists. We might have lived what you would consider to be communally, but we're not communists. What we had, our structure is completely different than anywhere else on the planet. And I'm not saying this to make us sound special, but if you go to other Indigenous nations, they'll have a different governance system. They'll have a different way of being on the planet. And so like when you look at Indigenous peoples, we don't fall into this fucking category. And if you are Indigenous and you're cut off from who you are, you don't need to go to Europe. You don't need to philosophize with all those white folks to have a better understanding of who you are. And if you're like, well, I don't know, and I'm separated, there are local Indigenous nations that will take you in. If you have a good heart and you work really hard and you're not like, you're coming there as humbly as you can, saying like, I really need you to connect. I sat, I'll totally wrap it up after this. I sat in ceremony with this Cree guy. He told me he was Cree. He was from some nation in Saskatchewan. He was adopted out, ended up in Calgary. And he spoke his language when he was a kid. He's an old guy now. But when I met him, he wasn't that old. He spoke Blackfoot fluently because he didn't know how to quite retrace his steps back home, but he got involved with some of the nation members and some of the society members, and he picked up our language, and he picked up our teachings and our philosophies. And some people don't have the option because their history was stolen by CFS. You know, their history was stolen by social services, and people want to connect. I would say humbly approach a nation, you know, like ask for that help and that guidance. And historically, we've always done this. So I'll go back to like when we would go take wives, or we would go live with their community. When we went to live with their community, we learned how to dictate and conduct ourselves as them. So let's say it was the Cheyenne and I went to go find a wife, and the Cheyenne were like, oh, stay with us. I had to learn the Cheyenne language. I had to learn how they run their ceremonies and how they conduct themselves. And that's what I would do as a good person. And if I was like a piece of shit, they would obviously kick me out of their village and, you know, tell me never to come back. But if you're really lost and really want to make that authentic, and this is for Indigenous folks, the spaces is for us. We're still dealing with being colonized. I'm sorry to say this to like settlers, and you'll find other Native people will have a different sentiment, but this is mine. For all the Indigenous kids that are taken by CFS, those spaces are reserved for them in our ceremonies. And that's what you need to think of before you want to go in and save an Indigenous nation. That space that you're sitting in, that belonged to one of the kids that's now in custody of CFS, or that's in jail, or that's just lost. But if you are one of these people and you're listening and you're Indigenous and you don't know how to reconnect, try to find those connections within the city. There's usually an Indigenous center. Try to find these elders. Really immerse yourself in that community. Really, and if you are accepted in, realize you represent your ancestors, the ones that should have died, like my grandma, and my grandpa, my parents who survived the fucking residential schools. You become that example, that shining example for your family. So you really want to conduct yourself in a really good way if you are allowed in with these communities, and just do your best. You're going to make mistakes. I made mistakes in ceremonies, sitting with like other people's and having them like laugh at me because I didn't know any better. And that's fun. You know, you learn from that. And there's also a pride that these nations have when they see me with them. You know, they're like, oh, there's that Blackfoot man again. And, you know, we're going to help him out a little bit. So yeah, it's there for us. And if you're a settler colonizer, just remember those spaces that you're in. If you're already in them, those spaces inherently are for our own people. So that's really up to you what you're gonna do with that knowledge. I can't make you do anything or not do anything. I could just tell you this. So, yeah.
Well said, Gitz. 100% with you on that. And I know with a lot of my Indigenous youth I work for who are separated from their community, they're scared to reach out to community because they don't know anything about their own history, and they're just very uncertain. I would say for those of you out there who are listening to that, your community or the community you live near wants you back in that community. Like, go and join in. Don't be scared. You're going to be welcomed with open arms. So, no,
be careful.
Scary. Be careful.
Too.
Yeah, go to the friendship centers. That's usually your best place to start to find the elders. But yeah, be careful. Don't be exploited at the same time.
Yeah. Some of our people are in really healthy positions.
Yeah.
Their minds are still tangled up from colonization. Their minds are still tangled up in dark places from, you know, the adverse effects of being in residential schools and then intergenerational trauma. So yeah, go into these places, do your best to try to protect yourself.
Yeah.
Especially if you're an Indigenous woman.
Yeah. So that, yeah, there's been some exploitation of Indigenous women in that realm for sure. So finding people that are on the red road, finding people that, if you're a woman or if you identify as a woman, find the women in your community. I think it's really important.
Yeah. That I couldn't. That concept never came to me as a dude. But like, if you align yourself with some fucking women who don't take shit, those are the ones that are going to protect you.
So it's the strong Indigenous woman that you hear white people complaining about. That's the woman you want to connect with. She will protect you and keep you safe and introduce you to elders and make sure you're in a good place.
Like, who would throw down with a Karen? That's who you want to align yourself with.
100%. Yeah.
Oh, so I got a question. Hold on.
Oh, I can't follow two things, so.
All right, so I got a question. An anonymous question. That's the word. Anonymous question. Where do Black people fit in this place? I think that colonizers have conditioned us to hate the things that they hate, and to judge the things that they hate, and judge the things that they judge, which is like homosexuality. And like, if you really think about it, there's a lot of cis white dudes that just want to bang other cis white dudes, and there's like cis white dudes that just want to bang everything, you know, but they judge themselves. There's so much shame or whatever. We've fallen into that condition of homophobia, mainly because of these serial rapists and serial murders of the residential schools, but also just the mentality that these settlers and these colonizers have. There's a lot of anti-Blackness I find within certain Indigenous communities towards our black relations. And like for myself, it's to unlearn all of that hatred, because some of the best philosophers and best activists, people who were engaging in self-determination, some of my biggest teachers were dead black men and some dead black women, and some alive black women. Like, I'm so glad, you know, like if you look at like I'm so glad that they're here, and I was able to sit, like Dr. John Henrik Clark. He's amazing. He's an amazing African-centric historian for his people. And he's fucking one guy who can throw down with like white European doctors in history, and he can just make them speechless and just, he's so awesome. Malcolm X, or Malik Shabazz, when he actually went to Islam, or when he actually found Islam, I should say, when he went to Mecca. Martin Luther King, who is constantly like misquoted by white people.
All the time.
Yeah, and there's like the Martin Luther King, and then there's the Martin Luther King from the letter from Birmingham, and that's probably your best starting point, is the letter from Birmingham. If you really want to get to know how complex this guy was. Asad Shakur is another amazing, influential, and powerful black woman. Like, to read her writings, to witness her life, it's just so cool and dangerous. And like, even if we don't look at like those people from the past, like even today, like I just love, if you have a chance to sit down and listen to somebody like Issa, who has the TV show Insecure, like her creative process and opening doors and essentially kicking the doors down is crazy cool to hear. And you compare her story to Lena Dunham, this like white quote unquote progressive who I just fucking can't stand and hate. Lena Dunham was given her okay for her show Girls, like White Girls, on a one-page pitch. But Issa had to map out her entire television series, I think through 6 seasons or 5 seasons, plus character arcs, before they would greenlight her show. And she already had proven like all this stuff. But yeah, I mean, like when you can look at black philosophy, just black individuals, black revolutionaries, you'll see a lot of commonalities and the need for unity and how they want to unify themselves. Fred Hampton, like such a powerful story. His show, or the movie based on his life, Judas and the Black Messiah. It's a definite watch. Because there's so many ties. Like there's so many ties with the Black revolutionary movement of self-determination and Indigenous self-determination. Colonization as slavery, colonization as what they did to us. Like, so there's so many ties. Like slavery stole the history and the connection, or most of the connection with those Black people that they took here. Residential schools stole our history and destroyed our connection. Like there's so many interesting parallels that we have, but we have to overcome that anti-Blackness that's been conditioned into our heads. And we don't like see, you know, whatever kind of judgments you have, they're so fucking dumb anyways. But if you get rid of those judgments and you can look at, you know, people stuck in this very, very similar situation, we could fucking change everything. Like Black and brown coming together unconditionally can change everything overnight, you know.
100%.
And that's, once we realize that power, like once we realize that power and we get it together, it's fundamentally our future will look way better. So like the spaces for in my mind, there's always spaces for our Black brothers and sisters, and you know, those that aren't gender constricted, like Black people. I'll always have an open door for those people, if they want to come in, if they want to listen, if they want to learn.
I'll point out that Black Lives Matter showed up at Standing Rock.
Yeah.
Showed up at Standing Rock for us. And we need to show up for them as well. Like, we just need to show up for each other 100%.
Yeah. And seriously, there's a one specific pivotal scene that happened in real life that they captured in the movie Judas and the Black Messiah, and that's after they kill Fred Hampton. And they assassinated Fred Hampton. Like, they fucking drugged him and killed him. The colonizers drugged him and killed him, and then they said that it was like an accident, or that they fired back or whatever. And then you look at something like Wounded Knee, and how they came, or not Wounded, well, the occupation Wounded Knee, but you look at when they bastardized like Leonard Peltier, when they said he killed these FBI agents, like how far these colonizers are willing to go to remove leaders and potential leaders, and the things that they're willing to go through. Like even the story with Milton Born with a Tooth, and the murder charges that he had in the States. Like I don't believe it, mainly because of how they killed Fred Hampton, how they killed Malcolm X, how they killed Martin Luther King Jr., the lengths that they went through to imprison Leonard Peltier. Like I don't at all. Like even with like somebody like John Trudell, when he burned the American flag, and then his house was burned down with his wife and his kids. Like that's how far these fucking colonizers are willing to go to plant evidence, to heighten the tensions between us, to break down movements, even like anime. There's a whole side that people don't look at or connect with dots with the CIA, with the FBI, the infiltration of breaking down the Black Panthers with certain parties and certain chapters. I mean, not parties, but certain chapters, and within the AIM, and to break down AIM and to infiltrate AIM.
Yeah.
And to create this paranoid atmosphere. And like, it exists. And I just listed the people that they fucking killed, and the fact that they poisoned Fred and then they killed him. Like, there's no length that these people won't go to suppress us. But once there becomes Black and brown unity within the ghettos, within the reservations, it becomes something different. Like if we can get rid of this conditioning, and we can have like these safe havens for Black people, Black movements to come onto our reservations, and the exact opposite for us to go into their areas, their territories. Like that would change so much. Just that alone would change so much overnight.
It absolutely would, and it's starting to happen. It's slow, but it's starting to happen down in the States. AIM is coming back, right? And in Minneapolis and Tri-Cities, I think, they're coming back, and they're working alongside with the Black Lives Matter movement, and that's part of the reason things are getting so heated there, I'm sure. But it's also change. My dog's totally going to start barking any second. I guess I'm trying to get her to stop growling. But yeah, that's how we see change. I'm with you on that, Gitz. We stop saying the oppression Olympics. We stop, all have our stories. The colonizers have impacted us and our ancestors. We got to come together and not break each other down.
If you can change one thought in your mind, and I've been thinking about this a lot lately, it's not who has it worse. Who has it worse? The Indians on the reservation, the Blacks in the ghetto. Who has it worse? That's the wrong question to be asking, and that's the one that the colonizers have put inside of your head to ask. The question you should be asking is, who at this point in time do the colonizers hate more? And that's where you base your solutions off of.
Yes.
So do they hate BLM more? Do they hate Antifa more? Do they hate Idle No More? More? You have to ask yourself these questions. The question is, who do these colonizers hate the most right now?
I would say, if you're looking up Northern Turtle Island, they hate the land protectors right now. That is who they hate right now. Down south, I would say they hate the Black Lives Matter movement more than anything else. And yeah, like we got to make sure that we're standing by each other on both sides. You're totally muted. What? Julia.
There we go. I accidentally muted myself. No, but that's right. But if you wanted like anything, if you start empowering, like you start empowering Black people in your area, they're going to hate you more at that moment.
Yeah.
And here's the craziest thing that I don't understand. We're not looking to hurt people. We're looking to feed our people, to save our people, to educate our people, to pull ourselves out of this poverty slump that we're in. If you look at like all of these movements, at the basis of all of them, it's been self-improvement, no matter what like community you're in.
100%.
That's all it's really been about, you know. But to be threatened by that, it doesn't, to me, it just doesn't make any sense.
No, it doesn't at all.
All right, so there's two questions. What questions are they?
The first, oh, sorry, it's just in the Q&A, if you guys can see that.
I can.
Oh, there it is. Identities surrounding sexuality and gender is colonial, and the usage of two-spirit is new as early as 1990s. I'm curious, was a traditional language for Blackfoot people to identify? I am Blackfoot and Siksika, and I am gay. I'm curious, is there a language in Blackfoot to identify? Okay, we can answer this because Stacey, if you're on this side or this side of me, can also provide an answer. There is, Arnell Tailfeathers had a posting. Oh no, he doesn't like to be identified. There was some Blackfoot person who had a meme about that word, that specific word. If you're from Siksika, you should look up an amazing, powerful individual who, like, I get nervous around because I don't want to mess up, because I don't want to let him down. Evan's Yellow Old Woman. Evans will tell you and educate you on the specific wording that Blackfoots had used. The gender roles are so interesting and cool, and they make so much sense to me for Siksikaitsitapi people. Like white people, they really believe in binary, like black or white, 1 or 0, male or female, penis or no penis. But I know with like Blackfoots, what I was told is that if they're if they're drawn to the role of the woman, then that's what they became. They were drawn to the role of the woman. If you were a dude, the community saw, but it's a little more intricate than this. But if you took on the role of the woman and that's what you wanted to be, then that's what the community saw you as and accepted you as. So if I was taking a wife or even a second wife, and you were that wife or that second wife, nobody saw that as like a homosexual interaction, because they saw you as a woman. They saw you fulfilling the roles and the obligations and duties and responsibilities that a woman would have in the community. But there were men that got together in a relationship. There were people who were like beyond what we would consider to be like gender. You know, they existed in this really interesting place, and we had people like that. And I'm not saying that like the backwards people, I'm not talking about but like backwards people existed, right? And what I mean by backwards people is that they were called contraries. They did everything differently, and that's where they existed. And we had a spot for them, and we had spots for, you know, these homosexual relations. We had spots for like bisexuals. We had spots for people wanting to take on that role of a woman. That was all there in the community, and there was nothing really wrong with them, as long as you were a good person in any one of these categories. You know, if you're a piece of shit, then you had a certain time to correct yourself before you were booted. So yeah, the person you need to ask is, and search out within Siksika, is Evan's Yellow Old Woman. And I honestly, how the amount of knowledge that he has, even though he's young, he's definitely somebody you should approach with tobacco. Like that's where I hold Evans. It's like, if you're looking for knowledge and questions and you really want to get like your mindset, then go talk to him, but go bring him some tobacco, because that's where I view him. And if you don't have any tobacco and you want to go see him, I'll give you some tobacco to go talk to him, because he will change your life. So yeah, but like from your side and your people, Stace.
Oh, actually really similar, which I had no idea. For the North Nations, we had, like, gender wasn't something that was labeled, right? It wasn't something that specific. And your roles, like, I was born receiving my Ninisks, so my grandfather's knowledge, which meant I sat on the male side of the lodge. It meant that I participated in all the what people would consider male-based activities. And that was one way that gender identity was in your spiritual realm. But like my Ninisk always told me that, like, as far as sexual preference, whoever you love, you love. As far as sexual identity, you know your spirit, and you be your spirit that you are. And we were helped, like, who were in this realm where there was no gender, actually were held to a higher place within the community, because they understood things in ways that other people couldn't understand. So very similar, I think, to what you were saying with the Blackfoot, the North Nation. My understanding is we had 13 genders. That's my understanding.
Yeah, and it is what it is. The people who are confused don't know your people, and if you're confused, it's because of colonization.
Yeah,
And that's it. Once you reconnect with the people, you'll see there's a whole bunch more love and acceptance than there is of hate and judgment. And if, like, oh my god, I can't fucking stand. I really can't stand people like Ben Shapiro, any of them at all, because they come from this really hateful binary place. It's either one or the other, and these hypotheticals that make no sense at all. They don't know you. They don't know you as a Siksikaitsitapi person. The people that are around you, like the communities, all of them, like Calgary, all of fucking Alberta, all of Canada, all these places filled with settlers and colonizers, they don't know who you are. You know who you are. You know your truth. You know what guides you. And like the rest of us, you just need people to help guide you, point you in the right direction. You go seek an elder. You go seek somebody who knows a little bit more about your questions. So yeah, just do that. You know, you're in a very great place, and just be empowered by everything that Evans is going to share with you. And don't be like, I'm scared because I don't want to fuck up around him, but you should be excited to go sit and learn from Evans. Yeah, because he's great, and I'll die defending Evans. And since you're like you're not B, you're my brother. I'll die defending you as well. You know, just like I said, just be a good person.
There's that kind of connects to another question I saw in there and I'll try to answer it. You might have a different opinion, Gitz. I guess we'll see. The question was how to approach, and as a colonizer, how do you approach an elder to learn stories? I don't remember the exact wording, but it was stories or teachings. And my answer to that would be, first of all, you should already have a relationship with an elder before you're asking them. If you're non-Indigenous, you should already have a relationship within community if you're asking for things. It doesn't start with, I want to hear your stories and your teachings. Here's some tobacco. It starts with going and showing up in community and helping and supporting where you're asked to. And as you gain those relationships, asking an elder for those things will feel quite natural. And you'll know how to do it because you'll have learned the protocol naturally being in the community. You work for a business or education system or something like that, they have people to organize that for you. But if it's for you personally, you need to get involved in community before you start asking for stories and teachings.
Yeah, that's like that thing on. And like I'll always add this to colonizers, settlers. I'll even add this to our own people with money, but they might not accept it. All right, but like when you're gifting, you know, like tobacco or whatever, and the protocols are different for every nation you're in and involved in. I would say that, like, if I was to go into, you said you're Nuu-chah-nulth, Stacey? So yeah, I have nephews and nieces who are also half Nuu-chah-nulth. They have on their mother's side. I would say, like, to them, if I was to approach an elder, if I was in the community, I'd be like, well, this is how we do it. But how do you guys do it? That's the very first thing I would say. I don't want to disrespect anybody, but like, how this is after you build community, or this is after you're welcomed into the community. And if you're not welcomed into the community, I wouldn't take that to heart and be pissed off about it, because we've had so many people come in and take, take our stories, take our opportunities, take the knowledge, and just fuck off and give nothing back. So the one thing I'll add is that if you're welcomed into the community, once you've established that relationship and you're sitting with the elder and you have your gifts, I'm going to say this, and other people will say don't. One of those gifts better be fucking money, and it better be like a lot of money. And here's why. You go visit an elder the fucking 4 days after Christmas, and you'll see where all of their money went. And it's gone right back into their families. And it kind of makes me a little sad when they've bought a bunch of gifts and they've gotten a bunch of stuff for their kids, and the kids all come and they share in that moment, and the kids are gone and they're there. The kids are still going to come visit. They're not just going to fuck off and come back for Christmas. But there's these moments where they're kind of by themselves, and you get to really see that these elders have given everything that they have to their kids and to their kids' kids, like any good grandparent would do. And because of that, you as a person, you should always keep that in mind, that when you're going to them, it's like, I'm not saying like a fucking $100. I'm saying like you give up some cash to them, along with everything else, along with honoring the protocols, along with everything else, because I want you to remember these elders give everything that they have, not just like the stories, but like what they physically have to their families. And always remember that.
Julie, were there any other questions? Those are the only two I saw.
No. So I think, I'm trying to start my video. It froze, of course. I think that's it. That's all. Thank you very much. And thank you. From the bottom of my heart, I always appreciate hearing you speak it, and of you, Stacey, always.
Cool. Oh yeah, one thing. Check out the Yesman video. It really, like, Indigenous peoples, it's some good medicines, good laughter. I really want to share with all of you right now, especially as we're in this time of mourning, especially as we're bringing our ancestors and our grandparents and our children back home. If you need that extra bit of laugh and you want to see some like reverse colonialism on white folks, check it out. If anything, if it makes you laugh, that's it. But just that's all I want to say. I love all of you out there. Be gentle with yourselves. Be gentle with others. If you're a Native male, ceremony, counseling, baby. Ceremony and counseling. And counseling is so difficult and terrifying, but it's also rewarding. Ceremony, counseling.
My Indigenous sisters out there, find your strong Indigenous women, surround yourself with them, hold each other up. Don't compete with each other, hold each other up, and heal within our ceremonies, because we have our ceremonies as women. Get in there, start joining them. And thank you, Julia.
Yeah, sorry, but I don't know why my video is frozen right now, so we should probably end this before it kicks us out. But thank you everyone for coming, and yeah, I don't know what to end this. Thank you.
Ciao.
Bye.